Hello, listeners, and welcome to Season 3 of the Cult Vault podcast. I'm your host, Kacey, and I wanted to update this introduction to offer a few additional trigger warnings about upcoming content. As you likely know, this is a podcast about cults, extremism, coercive control, and abuses of all types. A platform for survivors and victims to share their experiences, change misconceptions, and help advocate for and educate others. Given the recent election results in America and the nature of upcoming interview themes, I wanted to remind listeners that each episode comes with a content warning for themes of murder, abuse and harm, and abortion rights and restrictions. Please take care when listening to each installment. Self-care practices may include being outside for walks or gardening or leaning into friends and family and loved ones, or participating in an activity that brings you joy, like a trip to the cinema, or exercise, or taking a nap. Whatever self-care looks like to you, be sure to practice these things when listening to this material and any other material like this. For early access to ad-free episodes, you can find me on patreon.com/thecultvault for as little as £1 a month. Thank you so much for my patrons for being such a beacon of support, and I look forward to our monthly video call catch-ups at the end of each month. Lastly, I'm so very excited for my favourite weekend of the year in June 2025, CrimeCon UK in London on the 7th and 8th of June. Partnered with True Crime, this is going to be the biggest and busiest and best CrimeCon UK to date, with expert speakers, survivors and advocates of justice taking to the stage to discuss their work in the field of true crime. It's the UK's biggest true crime event, and it's jam-packed with talks and events throughout the weekend, with the most flexible ticket options available, including day tickets, night tickets, weekend tickets, concessions, and different options for payment plans available now at crimecon.co.uk. I will be at the event. I'm so glad that I've been invited back again, and hopefully you will see me up on the big stage. And I look forward to seeing you all there. Head to crimecon.co.uk and use the code CULT, C-U-L-T, at the checkout for 10% off your tickets. And patrons, you can contact me for an additional reduction in ticket prices. Now, on to today's show. Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Cult Vault podcast. I'm your host, Kacey, and today we're going to be diving into something that is different for the show, but is still so relevant, and I'm very excited to bring to you, listeners, Josh and Sarah from End Witch Hunts. Hi, Josh and Sarah. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Hi, thank you so much for having us, Kacey. I'm Sarah Jack, and I'm in Colorado in the United States.
Hi, I'm Josh Hutchinson. I'm in Arizona in the Phoenix area in the United States, out in the desert, and I'm the co-founder of End Witch Hunts along with Sarah.
So when we talk about witch hunts in the context that you both do your work in, what are we meaning by the term witch hunts? Is it what you would expect it to be, as it sounds sort of historically, or is it something a bit different to that, Sarah?
If you start with what you know to be true about historical witch hunts, but then realize they never ended, that's a good place to start. So what we are educating about, what we are advocating about is that women, children, men, anybody who's vulnerable can be the victim of a witch hunt. And I do mean literal. So due to fear of curses, superstition, sometimes the vulnerable become the scapegoat for situations and get hurt or die.
The specific work that you do, Josh, with End Witch Hunts, what is the overview of the work that you do, and what led to the two of you putting together this organization?
We do a variety of work to raise awareness of the types of witch hunts that Sarah was talking about, as well as ritual attacks, which are cases of people stealing body parts off living persons for the use in witchcraft or ritual preparations. So our main work is raising awareness of that. We talk about there's a United Nations resolution 40 about the elimination of harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft and ritual attacks. And we're spreading awareness of that. And we have a podcast called Witch Hunt. And on Witch Hunt, we talk to a lot of advocates who are out in different countries where witch hunts are really a major issue right now. And they tell us what things are working for them as they're trying to tackle this issue. And so we're collating basically all this information on what works in advocacy to try to curb these practices. We also do a lot of work with historical witch trials and respectful memory. So we've worked on exonerations and memorials for victims of historic witch trials, which we believe is a good way to call out that, as Sarah said previously, witch hunts really never ended. They still go on today.
That's so wild for me to learn about things that you hear from history books, things that feel so distant and unrelatable from the kind of centuries past, learning that those things are still very much happening, just maybe not in the you would see in TV shows like the Vampire Diaries, for example, just to pull out a fictional TV show where they have depictions of witches. I think that is kind of what I associate with stereotypical witchcraft and witch hunting, and to kind of understand that there are still people in the world being persecuted for something that feels like it took place centuries ago. It's really quite difficult for me to wrap my mind around. So I'm really looking forward to the two of you kind of taking me through the journey on understanding that it's still very much happening and the types of communities that are most at risk from this type of persecution. But I'm interested in learning, first of all, what personally drew you both to this work. It feels very niche and it feels very specific. So I wonder what the story is there, Sarah.
I am a descendant of women who stood trial in the 17th century in the American colonies. Rebecca Nurse is a well-known name because of Arthur Miller's The Crucible. She was actually a real woman, and my ninth great-grandmother, she was hanged in 1692 during the Salem witch trials. Also, her sister, Mary Esty, was hanged. Their grandchildren married, and I descend from both of those ladies through that line. I found out about Rebecca from a great aunt of mine who loved to do ancestral research. And so that had been kind of passed down and talked about in the family. But when I started doing my own research about 5 years ago, I realized that there was another woman and her daughter in my family tree in a different colony that faced witch trial, and that was Winifred Benham in Connecticut and her daughter, Winifred Jr. And I didn't understand what I was looking at. I thought there was only a witch trial in Salem. That's where I was just 5 years ago. I had no concept of what witch hunting was. And so my interest in that, I got online. I started looking for other people who were talking about it. Is there a memorial in Connecticut? I wanted to find out more about what happened there. And I discovered there wasn't a lot of information, but there were some people who were talking about it. And in 2022, there was an exoneration measure that was getting passed in Massachusetts for one of the convicted women of the Salem witch trials. And that was starting some media conversation and descendants talking. And that happening is what brought my colleagues and I together through our social media accounts. Josh was also working online, and he'll tell you about that.
Yeah, I also had ancestors involved in the Salem witch trials and some other Massachusetts witch trials. So I was online sharing information about the Salem witch trials primarily, and I had come across some articles in the past about witch hunts happening in the modern world, and just seeing those really got me interested in what was happening today, realizing that it hadn't ended everywhere. that this is still a problem. So once connected with Sarah and our colleagues, and we started the Connecticut Witch Trial Exoneration Project and got that going to clear the names of everyone accused of witchcraft in colonial Connecticut, which passed in May 2023. We got that going. We started a podcast, Witch Hunt, to mostly talk about Connecticut initially to make people aware, because we were finding when we were talking to people about it, they didn't know that Connecticut ever had witch trials. And we're talking to people in the state of Connecticut telling us that. So we were trying to raise awareness of that, but we also wanted to bring in witch trials from around the world. We were contacted by an advocate in South Africa who is working with an organization there to stop witch hunting. And so he really enlightened us. From there, we started connecting with advocate after advocate, and that really got us into the concept of how do we eliminate these harmful practices. And so that's where End Witch Hunts was born from.
It's wild to hear about the experiences people have when they're tracking their ancestry and going through the genealogy process. I can't believe that you can go back through your family tree and find ancestors that just had these experiences and kind of and had these sorry, my partner is with the kid. Oh, he's okay. Sorry, they're usually not in the house when I record.
It's totally okay, though, just because I want you to know I've got 4 upstairs right now being clouds. So,
yeah, just making sure he's okay with. It's just beyond my belief that you can go back through your genealogy and find people in your family tree that met this fate, and that it's still happening as well. What would you say was the cause of the Salem witch trials in the areas that you've explored and the kind of ripple effect further around the world?
The global phenomenon, really, witchcraft was present throughout the Middle Ages, but it wasn't prosecuted very often until a belief arose that witches covenanted with the devil and were involved in this diabolical conspiracy to bring down Christ's church. When you had that diabolical pact and conspiracy, that's what really fueled the witch hunts. The early demonologists who wrote about witchcraft and how to identify witches, how to try witches, those books, such as the Malleus Maleficarum, the famous Hammer of Witches, those books really were very popular. The Malleus Maleficarum was actually Europe's second most popular book. I believe it's still the second most printed book in the world behind the Bible. At least it was for a span of 200 years. And that was highlighting the printing press really enabled this book to get in everybody's hands, and literacy was increasing as the Middle Ages were ending and you got into the early modern period. So people were reading this and digesting it, taking it to heart. And it was very misogynistic, really believed that women, as the descendants of Eve, were inherently prone to being seduced by the devil. So that kind of nonsense was going around and really people believed it. And over time, you did start to get more skeptics, especially within the legal system. So by the time Salem happens in 1692, England is mostly done with witch trials. They're at the very tail end of the process. Salem happens in 1692 because of a variety of factors. People like to look at it and say, maybe the people who were sick really had ergotism or some other disease that, caused them to hallucinate and so forth. But their overall symptoms don't match ergotism at all. They had no gangrene, which is one of the effects of ergotism, which happens from eating moldy rye bread, basically. So that kind of theory, just trying to assign one single cause to it, really oversimplifies what happened. There was a lot of groundwork laid in just the political climate. They were at war with the French and Native Americans at the time in the colonies. King Philip's War had cost the colony of Massachusetts a fortune. They literally had to print money, which they hadn't done before, to try and pay their bills. It was a real economic downturn for the colonies. So it was bad economy. There was political uncertainty because the king had revoked the colony's charter. So they had no founding document authorizing them to have a government. And basically they were in this kind of interim government in the beginning of 1692. And the new governor arrived in the middle of May after dozens of people had already been accused. So you had all of that going. Of course, you had the religious atmosphere with the Puritans in control. Yeah. And the Puritans didn't always see eye to eye with each other. It was a congregational-based ministry. So each congregation could essentially make its own rules. And they would meet together in synods, but they didn't have a binding central authority. And even within congregations, different ideas would be controversial. There was waning membership in churches. This was the third generation of colonists, and they believed that they were collectively backsliding from where their fathers and grandfathers had been religiously. And they were seeing a decline in membership. Part of that was because the membership requirement was that you go up and you give a testimony of how you've been born again, essentially. And you had to be voted on by the congregation. Then there was disputes over whether your children and grandchildren were eligible to be baptized because, well, your grandchildren, especially because if your children were baptized, but they didn't become full members of the church, there was a debate. Can they have their children then baptized because they're half members of the church? And so this was a contentious debate. There's evidence this was debated within Salem. One of the churches adopted this halfway covenant where people who were half members could baptize their children. And the other church, the one in Salem Village, did not adopt it. And there was a lot of friction in Salem Village over the minister to begin with.
So a lot of really tactful sort of abuse of faith, really, in terms of if you don't do these things, then you will not be able to access these like church privileges, which I imagine would have been almost mandatory in people's lives at that point in time. And correct me if I'm wrong, because you are the experts, and I certainly am not. In terms of what communities and populations believed were people practicing witchcraft, what were some of the allegations that were placed against people? And during that period in history, do you think that there maybe were people practicing witchcraft, but maybe it just didn't look exactly how the government and people in positions of leadership, what they thought it looked like?
Well, it's really important to understand what they viewed as witchcraft and what they viewed as a witch. With these accusations, they were identifying allegations of women and young women, and even as young as 4 years old, someone who would have covenanted with the devil to cause harm, so diabolical harm. So the trials in Salem and the other colonies were centralized around the devil. As a culture, there was a lot of heritage of protective magic happening that would have been very popular, but kind of done in secret. They weren't looking for that. They were at this boiling point with 1692, where everything was not what the initial generation had dreamed and promised their children. Now these grandchildren are here. Something was wrong, and they knew it was the devil. And for the devil to destroy what they were doing, he had to have his own flock. And so they decided that it was these women. And some of the women that were accused were very Puritan. They started the allegations with some women that would be considered not very good Puritan women. But by not very far into it, you've got allegations against some of the most godly women. So they actually believed that they were the worst witches because they'd fallen the farthest. And so this diabolical fear was a big component of it. When you look at, so there wasn't, and that's what's really important to understand. There's a real distinction between witchcraft practices and what was happening there in the 17th century in the American colonies. And it's the same today, where those that are getting accused of witchcraft, they're not being persecuted because of their beliefs aren't wanted. They typically, unless they are a practicing witch, their accusation and their situation has nothing to do with practicing witchcraft. It goes back to, the fear of a curse that somebody right now is experiencing. And like the Puritan ministers and the men in power, they're trying to identify the cause of the misfortune. And so they are going to identify their neighbor or their grandma or an orphan and decide whatever source of power they have that is evil, they are using that to harm me. And that is, a common thread. But today, those that are practicing natural religions, I may identify as pagans or Wiccans, what they experience is religious persecution, which would be different than when somebody is accused of witchcraft and they're not practicing.
And I think that's where it's really difficult for me to kind of grasp the full concept. It's trying to divide those things in my mind and realize that they are two separate things. And I'm sure you come across this all of the time, and this is likely to be one of the hardest issues for you to overcome in your conversations. When people throw the term witch or witchcraft around, they're throwing it around as kind of one thing, and you're having to have the same conversation over and over again where you explain that actually what we're talking about is, religious persecution over here, and then we're talking about like witches and witchcraft over here. I mean, to me, I have to have conversations quite often about the difference between what a cult is and what the occult is. And oftentimes people will merge them together. And I suppose occultism in some way is more what you would find yourselves talking about in some capacity, even if it's just to tell people that that's not really what we're looking at. If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's even the intersection of women taking back power. So not necessarily feminism, but some of that does have to do with like Wiccan religions too. There was, just to bring up a very current instance in Salem this week, there was a recognition and special recognition for Stormy Daniels in Salem. She happens to be a practicing witch. Salem happens to be a place that practicing witches gather, and she has faced a lot and overcome a lot. And there was this is a really big deal. Now that's happening in Salem, and it feels meaningful to them, but the history that's actually there isn't any of those things. So we're often jumping through those hoops trying to differentiate that what happens with witch hunts and those witchcraft accusations of old and in similar situations today aren't necessarily the same thing as this religious freedom for identifying witches.
Any evidence that you've come across that there were people that were making these diabolical bonds with demons or trying to practice that type of witchcraft in the time of 1692 when everything was kind of coming to a crescendo? Or is this all just a narrative that's been conjured up to kind of, I don't know, try and change the way the prosperity is working out for people in different parts of America and the world?
I would say there's probably a few cases like that where somebody really was trying to harm someone through witchcraft in some way. But those cases are rare. We haven't come across any with Salem or the witch trials that we've studied so far where that happened. But I would say that it's probable that it did happen. People believed in the efficacy of magic. And so you might have been trying to maybe not directly harm a neighbor, but try to reap some benefit for yourself, at your neighbor's expense, maybe. So those kinds of things would have happened. People did definitely mutter curses. There's a case in Lancashire, England, the Lancashire witch trials involving the Pendle witches began with a young woman muttering something at a merchant that was passing by who apparently wouldn't give her something, and he evidently had a stroke while walking away from her. The symptoms that are described, basically, he was paralyzed in half his face and couldn't talk right and collapsed and that sort of thing. But she actually, the story is that she went to his son and apologized for cursing him because she really believed that what she muttered had caused that to happen to him. Whether she intended it or not, we wouldn't be able to discern. But there are some cases, but I'd say 99% of the time, maybe more, the person had absolutely nothing to do with witchcraft. There were some palm readers, diviners, fortune tellers that were involved. There were at least two of those I can think of in the Salem witch trials. Dorcas Hoare and Samuel Wardwell did some fortune telling and palmistry. But by and large, the casting of curses on different people wasn't really a conscious thing. It might have been an accidental thing, like just saying somebody, the devil take you, might be interpreted as a curse when you just mean, get out of here or whatever.
So this is 1692, and the Salem witch trials are not, they're not geographically constrained to Salem. They're happening all around the world. Before we hit record, I was telling you both about two elderly women that were accused of witchcraft in my town, and they were murdered. And there's a book as well. So I'm going to send you the link to that when we're finished in case you're interested in reading about that one. Yeah. I only learned about that because I was doing an enrichment project about the town that I lived in. I don't think I would have ever heard about this historical event and these two women being murdered if I hadn't gone into this project. Do you find that that's very common in places that you investigate and cases that you look at? These are just things that happened and nobody really talks about them or even knows about them in history passed down?
Yeah, it's cultural history like other pieces, but there's shame around it. There's misunderstanding around it. There's fear around it. So it's really part of our job, advocates, and that's not just Josh and I. There are hundreds of advocates in this world right now working to educate people about witch hunts and to save lives. But it's really our job to help teach. And even though we may and you are doing so much of the same type of work, we do have to revisit some of those same things that are misunderstood, but that it refines our ability to speak to it, which is great too. but it is a hidden history. And in Connecticut, a lot of people worked really hard to get that important legislation passed, which named 32 victims in the legislation. It is an apology from the colony. And the next thing we need is an exhibit. There's not a museum there that features this history. There's not a group memorial. But fortunately, there are a few individual stones to recognize a few of the women, but it's just it's a constant process. And when we're able to expand these memorials, it'll be powerful. It's not just about looking back and paying tribute and uncovering the stories, which is significant, but that will also help explain what's happening in our world right now. That is also a crisis.
It would help you with your work, I imagine, if there were memorials and more kind of public awareness and attention to this particular subject. We are kind of moving into a strange period in history. Maybe it feels that way just because I'm experiencing it in real time instead of just kind of reading history books and watching videos and learning about history that way. But this kind of 1692 almost satanic panic that I feel like I've read repeating itself in the 1980s, and now I feel like is definitely repeating itself again in the 2020s, with a lot of stuff going around about conspiracy theories involving things like the Illuminati and adrenochrome and celebrities drinking the blood of babies and all sorts of wild accusations that are being thrown out there that are not dissimilar to things that we've heard people be accused of in the past. So I'm wondering how you've tracked the history of witches, witch hunts, witch trials, and practicing witchcraft throughout history and up to kind of where we are today, and maybe how it's shifted and changed and how we identify and protect people from persecution. There's a lot of big questions all at once, really.
Yeah. I'll say through the podcast, we've been able to investigate a lot of different eras of witch hunting and persecution. So we recently had an interview with a gentleman, a historian, about the Albigensian Crusade, which was the pursuit of the Cathar heretics in southern France in like 1208, something like that time frame, and how that was a precursor to then witch hunts later on, the hunt for heretics, people who were going against what the church was advocating officially. So you had basically a process already begun with heretic hunts, inquisitions, things like that, the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from different European nations. You had a lot of persecutions where somebody who was viewed as being different or other was being persecuted. So there's a long history of this persecution, and you get to the early modern witch trials, and something 80 to 100,000 individuals in Europe and the colonies were accused, and about half of those were executed. So it was really a massive thing over a period of 200 to 300 years. Mostly it was concentrated, but you saw a whole lot of this in wherever you live in Europe. You were probably near a witch trial of some sort, but we talked about how that's hidden history, and we've encountered that even when we were in England. We did a witch tour in York. It was kind of a fun witch tour, but talked about some actual witch trials that happened in York and the surrounding country. And there were people on the tour who were lifelong York residents, and they had never heard these stories before. So you have that. Then basically the formalized, institutionalized witch trials ended in the 17th, 18th century, depending what country you're in. They ended a lot earlier in the Netherlands, for example, than they did in Scotland or Switzerland. So those ended mostly because of judicial skepticism about the evidence, that how could you actually prove that somebody was covenanting with the devil. There was no physical evidence. Nobody ever brought the devil's book or, his DNA or something to be tested. So it was very hard to prove. And that's basically why the trial stopped. But the belief in society continued. And so you saw all these extrajudicial persecutions of people. And that's what's still going on today. And I want to point out that these do happen in Europe and America. We have cases, a few of these situations every year in the States where somebody believes that a misfortune that they've suffered was caused by someone else's witchcraft and then violently attacks them and often kills them. So that kind of persecution is what's still happening today. We're mostly here to talk about the literal witch hunts, but we know that the term witch hunt has really been, the literal aspect has been usurped, at least in American culture and I believe elsewhere, by the metaphorical type of political witch hunt,
Right.
which really has nothing to do with the other. There's a very loose thread there that it's an unjust persecution, but the very real literal ones still happen today. Between 2009 and 2019, UN identified at least 20,000 cases of this persecution around the world, and that's believed to be a significant understatement because this often happens in secret and often involves people's own family members or the community that they're in. So the word might not get out about it. It might not be reported to any authorities. There's often not an understanding of the laws that can be applied to get justice in those cases.
So it's kind of making me think of honor-based violence in terms of how we've had a case over here where a young woman decided that she wanted to experience more of a non-Muslim high school experience. And through moving away from traditional Muslim practices, her father ended up murdering her in an honor-based murder to appease a lot of the community members that also happened to be men that thought that the daughter had stepped too far into, I quote, she'd been westernized, and that was such a massive sin or such a massive deal to the community that she was no longer allowed to live. And it was her father's duty to carry out that crime. So we do have legislation in place that criminalizes honor-based violence, but it feels very similar in that way that if you step out of a certain set of stringent rules, then you are going to face the consequences that might just be like verbal abuse, physical abuse, or actual death. So if you kind of strip the terms away and you strip the language away, what you're left with is a framework that looks very similar from one case to another. And I don't know if that sounds right to you or if you would say it's actually very different.
I would definitely say that's right, that there are a lot of different types of harmful practices that are related to spiritual and ritual abuse of different forms. Basically saying that, I mean, any kind of belief-based persecution, definitely there's a lot in common there and what's motivating that to happen. And then the consequences can be the same. We've had a notorious case several years ago here in Arizona of an honor-based killing. A man killed his daughter for very similar westernized reasons. And so one of the projects that we're working on in witch hunts now is our in spiritual and ritual abuse project. We're basically doing a lot of data gathering at this stage on cases in the United States of honor-based killings, female genital mutilation, child marriage, any of these types of belief-associated abuses. We are actually looking at those. There is language, that resolution I referred to earlier by the UN Human Rights Council, Resolution 47.8, does have a language in there that nobody's human rights should be violated on the basis of somebody's belief. So that is part of the mandate with that resolution also.
I can also see how that would be exploited by people that want to exploit, though, especially faith-based leaders that will use that as a loophole to continue harming others by saying you can't do anything to me because you'll be harming my beliefs, if that makes sense. And kind of use it to perpetuate things. But that's a whole conversation for a whole other time. So I was looking at your website before. There's so many things on there. There's not only the Massachusetts Witch Hunt Justice Project and the Salem Witch Hunt Project, but there's also a lot of information on the website about how you work with educational organizations and you kind of work with people for legal advocacy. How do you go about this process? Do you just go kind of and find people that are already researching or speaking about this type of thing? Or do you go out and do you initiate conversations with policymakers or people that, do you go to councils and townspeople and say, you should be looking at this and talking about this? How does it all work?
Well, there's a variety of layers there, and our advocacy arm, essentially, we do a lot of letter writing campaigns to leaders in the United States and internationally about these issues. For a project like the Massachusetts Witch Hunt Justice Project and the Connecticut Witch Trial Exoneration Project, that was working directly with legislators at a state level to get those passed. So we have that there. As far as any legal advocacy for survivors, that's done by organizations that are in those countries where those cases happen. We haven't encountered an advocacy specifically for that in the United States yet, for legal advocacy if you've been accused of witchcraft and attacked. But there are groups like the Advocacy for Alleged Witches in Nigeria, which is Leo Igwe's group, and they'll provide financial assistance, help move them to a safe location, do a variety of services, get health care, those kinds of things. And then there's other organizations. Well, an element of what that advocacy does and what some other advocacies do is to kind of disseminate awareness in local villages. And so they will have meetings with the village leaders, the community leaders, religious leaders about these things. There will be street theater gets used, community-wide meetings are called, and messages are shared about these. And we see this happening in India, Papua New Guinea, across Africa, a variety of advocacies working from different angles because it takes holistic solution to solve this kind of a crisis. So you have advocacies mostly that are in the most affected communities are able to do the best work in terms of raising the awareness there. We're more raising the awareness among leaders nationally and internationally and drawing others into the cause of doing that.
And we really hope that the conversations we bring to the Witch Hunt podcast inform people of a platform they may have that they don't even realize. We've had guests connect that weren't working together previously through hearing each other's episodes. And so one of the ways that we're able to contribute right now is just keep bringing in these conversations and perspectives and the layers. That's all for there. And up there.
It sounds as though the more work you do, the more work you realize you could be doing, kind of, and it's just growing and growing and growing. I'm not sure like what your plans are to manage all of those things, whether you're going to have to say, right, we need to put a lid on things there and just kind of stick with this, or whether you'll bring more people on board. I did realize that there's a volunteer tab on your website, which I'm going to make sure I put in the episode description in case anybody wants to have a look, as well as links to your Witch Hunt podcast. But Sarah, what would you say is the most inspiring or successful story that you've had to date for you personally through your work with End Witch Hunts so far?
Our biggest success was the Connecticut Witch Trial Exoneration Project to date that involved dozens of volunteers. It was really a collaborative effort between volunteers, both within Connecticut and around the country, to get that done. So we feel really proud of being able to do that.
Yeah. What's really great about that project, and as you mentioned, it's like everything just keeps like opening up bigger and bigger on itself, and we have more in our lap. Leo Egwe, who is the director of advocacy for alleged witches in Nigeria, he was on a speaking tour in the spring of May of 23, and that aligned with when we were pushing to get our legislation through. He was able to come to New England. We were able to set up speaking engagements for him, so he had that opportunity for just the public engagement. The Rebecca Nurse Homestead in Danvers had him in as a guest. That was very special. He spoke at a university in Connecticut, but he went to the Capitol and he was able to engage with our politicians that were working on the legislation. And he spoke with the senator a week before the Senate went to vote on our legislation. So it's a huge success. Just bringing the two together, bringing the modern voice and then getting that history voice heard is a huge success. And we get to have these little celebrations regularly because we're always doing work. And so we do get to see the wins like that.
And I bet it feels so worth it, and it motivates you to keep wanting to reach out to people and building a bigger and bigger and bigger project. What do you see for the future of End Witch Hunts? Do you have kind of like a roadmap or an idea of where you're heading, or are you just kind of taking things as they come? Because you said at the start that you only originally planned to look at witch trials in one area, and now you're kind of like traveling the world, appearing at conferences and speaking about this matter over here in England, but just kind of like growing organically, I suppose.
Right. We do have a strategic plan that we've laid out, and we're beginning to update it right now because it continues to evolve. Like you pointed out, there's more that needs to be done. So we are looking to incorporate more volunteers to assist with these projects, to expand the organization. Right now, we're just taking things a day at a time. We schedule out, we can work on this particular project on this day of the week, and then this project on this other day, and kind of manage things that way. But it does get where if you look at the whole elephant, you lose your appetite because you're never going to finish eating it. So we try to just keep in mind that we're just doing one bite at a time. Not that we're in favor of eating elephants. I want to stop the slaughter of elephants, by the way.
Yeah, just tag that onto all of the work that you're doing. Today we're going to be talking about ending witch hunts and also don't eat elephants.
Right. You do not poach.
So, Sarah, if you were going to walk into a room of people that were like myself, who have this idea of what they think witches and witch hunts and witch trials are, what would be your way to summarize the work that you do and kind of pitch your organization to a room full of people that just really are quite clueless?
Fortunately, I get invited to speak at local chapters like an ancestry club or, something like that. So I have had some practice. So with those opportunities, I get to start with the history. But let's say I go to a networking event for podcasters and I just have, a few moments. You can see that only so much registers because it really takes people off guard. But I just, I say the name of our podcast. I might say that I'm a descendant of someone who stood trial for witchcraft and she was innocent. And then I go right to the fact that it is a global crisis of violence against women and children right now. And I try to talk about it from a terminology that resonates because they're maybe, more familiar with domestic abuse or other words that can connect that this actually intersects with those abuses too.
The whole time we've talked about this, all I can think about was violence against women and patriarchal practices. And especially when, Josh, you started mentioning female genital mutilation and those types of practices that are kind of becoming more and more common all around the world, even if they are criminalized and legislated against in, most countries.
Right.
So, Josh, if you had to walk into a room and give an elevator pitch on sort of like the one thing that you would like people to take away from your organization and your work, what would be your kind of 60-second summary of the work that you do and the most important key messages in that work?
I'd say witch trials never ended. They went underground and people began persecuting alleged witches who were innocent of what they're accused of entirely, that people continued to persecute those and persecute them still today. And our organization is working to raise awareness of that and ultimately to eliminate those witch hunts, which are known by the United Nations as harmful practices related to accusations of witchcraft, and ritual attacks, which are related, which are violence against persons believed to have magical body parts, essentially for use in potions or for good luck or good fortune. Working against all that.
Like you said, it's kind of one day at a time, but I think it's really, really amazing work. The things that you've both and the whole organization and you and your colleagues have been able to achieve in getting kind of recognition and exoneration for people that were killed for being falsely accused of, I don't even really know what. I suppose you've talked a lot about the devil, and sorry, you go.
Yeah, but I was going to say, you did ask me, what were they accused of? And I never quite articulated that. So, Josh, did I interrupt you?
I was just going to say kind of what the actual on the ground accusations basically were between, usually it was one neighbor accusing another of bewitching their livestock, their crops, their children themselves, following an argument of some kind. So for the average person, they were really more concerned with the harm that was done by witchcraft than what the ministers were concerned about, and the leadership was concerned about the diabolical conspiracy. For the average person, the devil was kind of a side element to the story, and really it was about they caused my cows to die and my goat wouldn't give the right kind of milk anymore, that kind of thing.
Absolutely frightening time to be alive, where all you had to do was get on the wrong side of somebody and they could accuse you of something that couldn't be proved, and then you would just lose your life for it.
Yeah, it is. It is comforting to know, though, there were many witch trials or witch accusations that fizzled out. So as many as these enormous numbers of deaths are horrific, there were more that never got that far because somebody in leadership stopped it, or something happened with the accusers. It didn't move forward. Maybe the alleged witch found a foot to stand on, to be able to stand up for herself. That did happen. Josh mentioned how witch trials went underground because of the evidence that was being required. One of the problems with Salem is their evidence standards were low. They were even lower than what they'd been previously in other colonies or in England. They were allowing these accusations of your specter choked me at midnight. Those kinds of things were accepted in that, as they were convicted on choking, using their specter, their spirit to murder. And so I just wanted to clarify, people can still believe those wild types of occurrences, but it's outside the court now. So there is no standard of evidence for these people who are finding themselves accused. And many of them aren't having an opportunity to defend themselves. The mob mentality that happens is very scary now. And groups of men can just go in and pull out a grandfather out of his bed because his family is out of town for the night. There's some really sad situations that are happening. So the education and getting information out and getting people talking about this and people paying attention to what they're able to do to encourage the recognition of human dignity and stop violence. It really boils back down to that, but it's a very big world with complex societies, complex laws, complexity to rights that are there and aren't there.
I do want to add quickly that there are a few nations where witchcraft and sorcery are still against the law nationally. There are court trials recently in Libya, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. I read about these periodically of people being arrested for witchcraft and actually prosecuted by the state. And that does include executions. So it still happens on a state level, but the vast majority of what we're talking about is this underground, non-court-based activity.
It's like entrenched historical fear still permeating modern day, not just kind of on a Christian level, but I imagine still very much so linked to major religion in some capacity, whether it is Christianity or Hinduism or one of the other major religions. It's been so illuminating to have this conversation today. Are you both going to be attending any more conferences in the near future?
We will. I don't have anything to announce today, but we are always looking for that. We're a young organization, so our budget is young as well. So as we grow and as we're able to raise more funds, we will be able to go out more personally. It's very important for us to be able to participate in conferences. There's academic conferences, there's human rights conferences, pop culture and folklore conferences. Those are all great opportunities to bring this conversation in.
And I noticed there's also a donate button on your website. So I know that there is a way that people can help you to be able to attend these conferences and to grow your resource pool, volunteer-wise and donation-wise. When it comes to any listeners that are curious about their ancestry or their ties to a potential witch trials or if people are interested in learning about the history of maybe the area that they live in, what would you say, or just to get involved with the organization in any capacity, what would you say is the best way for people to reach the two of you?
You can email me directly at it's josh@endwitchhunts.org, and I'll be happy to talk to you if you're interested in the organization on any level. If you want to research your ancestry, we did an episode on the podcast about tracing your Salem witch trial ancestors, and that you can apply that to any location, the information that we have there.
So yeah, we love to hear from people. This information does resonate with people, and they'll have a different reason for it interest that, it grabs their interest. And whatever that interest is you may have, we do want to hear about it. It's not ever irrelevant, and there's very possibly a great impact that you can make to this conversation.
This has been fantastic. Thank you both so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to learn today, and I am glad that I can come out of this conversation being maybe slightly better versed in some of the differences between the terms that we've discussed today, and hopefully then contribute to more helpful conversations around the subject going forward, rather than kind of being one of these people that is misinformed and making your jobs, I imagine, more difficult. And going forward in speaking about spiritual and ritual abuse, as I will be at the National Working Group Conference next month, I'm going to be remembering this conversation and pulling all of the threads together that kind of have coercive control in the center of the work that I do. And this is now one of those threads that's going to be tied onto that rock in the middle. And I so appreciate the both of you. This is such excellent work. I hope that you'll come back on the podcast and give us an update in a year's time, maybe, or so.
That would be excellent. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah. Thanks for the great questions and engagement on this. It was really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. And I hope that you enjoy the rest of your day. Take care and stay in touch.
All right. You too. Thank you.
Bye.